What does a man hear when the world decides to erase him? When the sky screams so loudly that even his own thoughts are drowned out, and the only question left is whether death will take him before guilt does. The blizzard came down on Wyoming at the turn of the new year in 1883 like a living thing, furious and endless, swallowing land, sound, and sense, until there was no difference between sky and ground. Only a white violence that stripped the world bare. Snow drove sideways with such force, it felt like shattered glass against exposed skin. The wind howling low and deep, not like weather but like an animal in pain. Somewhere inside that frozen chaos staggered Caleb Turner, a man already broken long before the storm found him. He moved without direction, boots half frozen to his feet, breath tearing from his chest in ragged clouds that vanished instantly, his body pushed forward by nothing but instinct and the stubborn refusal to lie down and disappear. Caleb had once been known as a handsome man, the kind people remembered even years later, but the storm cared nothing for that. Blood had frozen along his cheek and beard, dark against the white, and beneath the ice and exhaustion his face was drawn sharp with pain. A strip of black cloth was tied firmly over his left eye, rough and weathered, the knot biting into skin already numb. The other eye, his only one, was wide and burning, alert even as his body failed him, holding fear, memory, and something worse than fear, regret. Every step sent a jolt of agony through his legs, and his hands, cracked and bleeding, barely felt the reins of the dead horse he had long since abandoned when it collapsed beneath the storm. He had been running before the snow began, running hard and without looking back, away from the cattle camp and the gunfire, and the sound of a man he loved as a brother hitting the ground. Ethan Cole's face haunted him with every staggered breath, not dead, not then, but bleeding, shouting, reaching. Caleb had heard his name in that moment and still turned away. Survival had chosen him, or perhaps he had chosen survival, and the choice had carved itself into his bones. The storm only finished what guilt had started, beating him down until he could no longer tell if the cold shaking his body came from the weather or from the memory of his own cowardice. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours or collapsed entirely, and more than once Caleb wondered if he had already died and this white emptiness was what came after. Then, through the blur of snow and pain, something dark broke the endless pale, a low mound rising from the ground, half buried, stubbornly present. He nearly walked past it, his eye failing to focus, his mind slowing. But some last fragment of will dragged his feet toward it. A sod cabin, sunken into the earth, its roof heavy with snow, its door almost invisible beneath drifts that reached his waist. It looked less like shelter than a grave, but it was the only solid thing he had seen in what felt like a lifetime. He reached the door with the last of his strength and struck it once, twice, the sound swallowed by wind. The third blow was weaker, his shoulder giving out, his weight sagging forward until his forehead rested against the wood. Inside, silence answered him at first, and then the faintest sound of movement. The door opened only a hand's width, held by a woman whose eyes were sharp with suspicion, her body angled as if ready to slam it shut again. Abigail Moore had lived too long alone to trust what the storm delivered to her doorstep. She took him in with a single look, not at his face, but at the color of his skin, the tremor racking his frame, the way he swayed where he stood. Whatever he was dying. That mattered more than caution, more than fear. She pulled him inside with a strength that surprised them both, shutting the door against the storm as if sealing it out by will alone. The cabin was small, one room pressed into the earth, warmed by a stubborn stove that glowed dull red. The air smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and something scorched, a bitterness that lingered near a half-burned Bible resting on a shelf like a wound that refused to heal. Caleb collapsed onto the floor before she could speak again, darkness rushing in fast and merciless. When he woke, it was to heat, real heat, painful in its intensity, as blood returned to places long abandoned by feeling. He groaned despite himself, his breath catching as Abigail worked quickly and without tenderness, stripping away frozen layers, forcing warm broth between his lips, rubbing life back into hands that barely looked human. She said nothing unnecessary. He noticed everything anyway. The distance she kept, the way she avoided his eye, the careful line she drew between help and mercy. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them together in that narrow space, two strangers bound by weather and fate. Caleb lay on a pallet near the stove, listening to the wind batter the walls, wondering if this cabin was a reprieve or merely the place he would finally stop running. His single eye followed Abigail as she moved, efficient, guarded, her presence both saving him and reminding him that survival always came with a cost. He did not yet know what she had buried in this place, nor what the storm would force them both to uncover before it let them go. The storm did not loosen its grip after Caleb woke. If anything, it seemed to press harder, as if offended that he had not yet died. Day after day, the wind battered the sod walls, snow hissing against the door and roof in a constant, nerve-wearing roar that made conversation feel unnecessary, even foolish. Time inside the cabin shifted into something slow and heavy, measured not by hours but by the rise and fall of the stove's heat, by how often Abigail added fuel, by how long Caleb could sit upright before pain drove him back down. Whatever this place was, it was not refuge given freely. From the moment he could stand, Abigail made that clear. She set the rules without ceremony. He would eat what she gave him, sleep where she told him, and work when he was able. There would be no questions about her past, no assumptions about her kindness, no expectation that his presence was welcome beyond necessity. Shelter was a transaction, not a gift. Caleb accepted every condition without argument. He was in no position to bargain, and in truth, the clarity of her terms brought a strange relief. Guilt was easier to carry when it could be repaid with labor. When his hands stopped shaking enough to hold an axe, Abigail sent him outside. The cold still bit deep, but it no longer felt like an enemy intent on killing him. Now it was something to be endured, something familiar. He chopped wood until his shoulders burned and his breath rasped, stacking the pieces neatly against the wall the way she liked. He shoveled snow from the door, from the small animal pen, from paths that disappeared again within hours. Each task grounded him, dragged his mind away from memories he did not want, and back into his body, into the ache of muscles and the simple logic of survival. Inside, Abigail moved with practiced economy, never wasting motion, never lingering where she did not need to be. She spoke only when required, her voice steady and low, stripped of softness. She watched him closely, not with fear exactly, but with an alert wariness, as if she expected him to reveal himself as something else at any moment. Caleb felt the weight of that gaze more sharply than the cold. He did nothing to challenge it. He kept his head down, his words brief, his eye careful not to linger on her longer than necessary. Silence settled between them like another layer of snow, thick and muffling. Yet it was not empty. It carried small, telling sounds. The scrape of her knife against a cutting board, the soft thud of boots by the door, the crackle of the stove at night. Caleb learned her rhythms without meaning to. The way she rose before dawn, the way she paused for a moment each evening before extinguishing the lamp. Abigail learned his as well. The times his injured hand failed him, the way pain tightened his jaw long before he admitted to it. There were moments when the truce wavered, when something unspoken rose close to the surface. Once, while Caleb was mending a broken fence post inside the barn, he heard a sound that did not belong to the storm or the animals. A sharp, breathless sob. He froze, tool half raised, instinct urging him to retreat, to give her privacy. But when he turned, he saw Abigail standing alone, shoulders rigid, face turned away, tears cutting clean lines down her cheeks she did not bother to wipe. He said nothing. He did not move closer. He simply stayed where he was, present without intrusion, until the moment passed and she straightened, anger flickering briefly across her face at having been seen. She did not thank him for his silence, but she did not rebuke him either. Another time, he reached for a blanket near the stove without thinking, fingers brushing against rough embroidery. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Abigail snatched the quilt away, her breath coming fast, eyes wide and dark, as if he had struck her. She told him never to touch it again. The words were sharp, final, and carried more fear than anger. Caleb backed away at once, hands raised, apology tumbling out clumsily. She turned from him, gripping the quilt to her chest like armor. The message was clear. Some things in this cabin were not part of any bargain. At night, as the storm screamed on, sleep came in fragments. Caleb dreamed of gunfire and snow, of Ethan's hand slipping from his grasp, of white emptiness swallowing everything he had ever known. He woke drenched in sweat, his single eye burning in the dark. Abigail pretended not to notice, though sometimes he sensed her awake as well, sitting near the stove, wrapped in stillness that felt heavier than rest. Slowly, almost against their will, the sharp edges of suspicion dulled. Not trust, never that, not yet, but a cautious acknowledgement of shared endurance. They ate together in silence. They worked side by side without comment. When Caleb faltered, Abigail handed him what he needed without meeting his gaze. When she slipped on the ice, he steadied her with a hand to her arm, withdrawing instantly, both of them breathing a little too fast afterward. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Inside, neither did they. And yet, in the relentless exchange of labor for warmth, of effort for survival, something fragile took shape between them. Not comfort, not forgiveness, but a truce forged by necessity, held together by silence, and haunted by wounds neither was ready to name. The storm began to change, not by easing, but by settling into something deeper and more suffocating, a constant presence that erased the idea of an outside world entirely. Days blurred together until even the rhythm of labor lost its sharp edges. And in that suspended time, what had been buried beneath necessity started to rise. Silence, once protective, grew heavy enough to crack. It was not conversation that broke it, but exhaustion, the kind that strips defenses away and leaves only truth behind. Caleb felt it first, the pressure building inside him as his strength returned and his mind refused to stay quiet. Work no longer dulled the memories the way it had in the beginning. Each swing of the axe brought back the echo of gunfire. Each night by the stove sharpened the image of Ethan Cole lying in the dirt, blood darkening his coat, eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Caleb had survived because he ran. The fact sat in him like a stone, impossible to swallow, impossible to spit out. He told himself he had no choice, that staying would have meant death for both of them. But the arguments rang hollow in the small hours of the night when the wind rattled the walls and there was nowhere left to hide. Abigail noticed the change in him before he spoke a word. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in how his single eye followed shadows that were not there, in the way he flinched at sudden sounds. She had lived with ghosts long enough to recognize them in others. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had taken him in as a body to be saved, a problem to be managed. She had not planned for his presence to mirror her own buried pain so clearly. The moment came without ceremony, as these things often do. They were sitting near the stove, sharing a thin meal, the wind howling low and relentless outside. Caleb's hand began to shake, the spoon rattling softly against the bowl. He set it down with care, staring into the fire as if answers might be waiting there. When he spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of anything that resembled pride. He told her about the cattle camp, about the argument that spiraled into violence, about Ethan stepping between him and a rifle barrel meant for someone else. He spoke of running, of the sound Ethan made when he fell, of how that sound followed him into the storm. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not excuse himself. He simply told the truth, as if laying it bare might lessen its weight. Abigail listened without interruption. She did not offer comfort. She did not soften her expression. When he finished, the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was deliberate, searching. Then she said quietly that the world did not care how good a man you had been yesterday if today you were weak, and that survival often looked like betrayal from the outside. The words were not meant to absolve him, but they did something else entirely. They acknowledged the cruelty of a world that demanded impossible choices and punished those who lived through them. That acknowledgement loosened something in her as well. The storm had already taken everything else. It might as well take her silence too. One night, with the wind screaming and the cabin creaking under its weight, she told him her story. Not in a rush, not in fragments, but in a steady voice that suggested she had repeated it many times alone. She spoke of Judge Harold Whitmore, of his kindness offered as a mask, of the way power had made him untouchable. She spoke of being taken, of being blamed, of carrying a child that no one would claim as innocent. Her father's face hardened in her memory as she described his refusal to look at her, the way the community closed ranks and turned her into something shameful and disposable. She spoke of the stillborn baby without breaking, as if grief had long since burned itself out, leaving only ash. Caleb did not look away. He did not ask questions that demanded details she did not give. He felt a familiar heat rise behind his eye, a fury that had nowhere to go, useless against events long past. What he felt instead, deeper and steadier, was recognition. Exile wore different shapes, but the weight was the same. He understood now the burned Bible on the shelf, the quilt she guarded so fiercely, the way she kept the world at arm's length. Shame had driven her here just as surely as guilt had driven him into the storm. The night the stove faltered, nearly dying beneath the strain of endless use, they were forced closer than either had planned. The cold crept back into the cabin, sharp and insistent, and there was only one place warm enough to survive the night. They lay on opposite sides of the narrow bed, fully clothed, backs tense, bodies rigid with restraint. The space between them felt wider than the prairie. Somewhere in the dark, Abigail shifted, her breath uneven. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against Caleb's shoulder. The contact was light, tentative, and carried no demand. It was not desire that moved her, but the quiet admission that she could not endure another night alone. Caleb did not move. He did not turn toward her. He let his breathing slow, steady, offering warmth without claiming anything else. In that small, careful stillness, something essential passed between them, fragile and unspoken. It was trust, perhaps, or simply the courage to be seen in weakness. Morning brought clarity and fear in equal measure. Abigail pulled away, shame flickering across her face, the old reflexes snapping back into place. Caleb, his voice low and honest, told her the rest of his truth, that he was a wanted man, that his name and face were printed on paper somewhere beyond the storm, that there was a price on his head. He expected her to tell him to leave. He expected the door to open and the cold to claim him after all. She did neither. She listened, weighed the truth, and said only that she knew what it meant to be judged without mercy. The storm outside roared on, indifferent, but inside the cabin, something irrevocable had shifted. What had been buried by snow and silence now lay between them, raw and undeniable, and neither of them could pretend anymore that survival alone was the end of the story. The storm ended without ceremony, as if it had grown tired of its own cruelty and simply withdrawn, leaving behind a silence that felt almost unreal. When Caleb stepped outside for the first time without the wind clawing at his face, the world looked wounded but alive. Snow draped heavy across the land, fences broken, the barn roof sagging, the sky pale and indifferent. The quiet was unsettling. After so many days trapped inside the roar, the absence of sound pressed in on him harder than the cold ever had. This was what survival looked like afterward. Damage laid bare, no longer hidden by chaos. They worked without speaking much, the rhythm of repair settling naturally between them. Caleb replaced warped boards, reinforced the roof, set posts back into the frozen ground with stubborn patience. Abigail hauled water, sorted salvaged supplies, mended what could be mended. Their movements were efficient, familiar now, shaped by weeks of shared endurance. The cabin slowly became whole again, not as it had been before, but stronger in places where it had nearly failed. There was satisfaction in that, a quiet pride neither of them named. For the first time since the storm began, hope felt less like a dangerous illusion and more like something earned. Yet hope made room for fear. It was easier to live inside the storm, where the world could not reach them. With clear skies came reminders that they were not alone, that roads existed beyond the drifts, that names traveled. Abigail found the newspaper folded beneath a crate while cleaning, the paper brittle, the ink smeared but legible enough. Caleb Turner stared back at her from the page, his face younger, unscarred by the weeks they had shared. His one good eye rendered flat and accusing. Beneath it, a reward, $50, enough to tempt the wrong kind of man. She said nothing at first. She folded the paper carefully, placed it on the table, and waited. When Caleb came inside and saw it, the color drained from his face. There was no point denying it. The truth sat between them, heavy and unavoidable. He felt the old reflex surge up, the urge to run before he could be driven out. This time, he did not wait to be told. He packed his few things with quick, practiced movements, avoiding her gaze, already bracing for the cold. He told her it was safer this way. That trouble followed him like a shadow, that she had survived alone before and would again. Each word sounded thin, even to his own ears. He was not trying to convince her. He was trying to convince himself. Abigail listened, arms folded tight against her body, fear and anger warring behind her eyes. The thought of returning to silence, to nights where the only sound was her own breathing, hollowed her out. She had built walls for a reason, but somewhere in the weeks of shared labor and guarded trust, Caleb had slipped past them. She stopped him at the door. The plea came out raw, unpolished, stripped of pride. She told him she did not want to be alone again. Not like before. Not with the memories closing in now that she knew what it felt like to share the weight. It was the first time she had asked anyone for anything since coming to this place. The admission trembled between them, fragile and terrifying. Caleb turned back, his resolve crumbling under the truth in her voice. Staying meant danger. Leaving meant abandoning her to the very exile that had nearly destroyed her. The choice felt final, irreversible. They stayed. Spring pushed its way in slowly, the snow retreating inch by inch, revealing earth scarred but stubbornly alive. With the thaw came something neither of them had dared to hope for. Abigail realized she was pregnant when the sickness lingered and the familiar signs refused to be ignored. The news struck her like a blow, dragging old terror up from deep inside. She remembered the pain, the loss, the way hope had once turned against her. She waited for Caleb to speak first, bracing herself for fear or doubt. He surprised her. He knelt beside her, took her hands with careful steadiness, and told her they would face it together. He began building a cradle from salvaged wood, rough and uneven, the joints imperfect but strong. Each nail he drove felt like a promise hammered into place. Abigail watched him with a mixture of gratitude and fear, knowing how easily the world could take this from them too. The knock came one afternoon when the sun hung low and the air smelled of thawed earth. A deputy stood at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, his posture stiff with duty. He carried a summons bearing the seal of Judge Harold Whitmore. The past had finally caught up to them, not with guns or accusation, but with paper and law. Abigail's breath caught painfully at the name. Her body remembered what her mind wished to forget. Caleb's instinct was immediate and fierce. He would go. He would not run again, and she would not stay behind. The town felt smaller than Abigail remembered, its streets too narrow, its eyes too sharp. Whispers followed them like insects. The courthouse smelled of dust and old wood, authority lingering in every shadow. Judge Whitmore sat diminished on the bench, age and illness having stripped him of much of the power that once made him untouchable. When Abigail stood before him, she felt the old fear surge, but it did not control her. She demanded the truth, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for release. The confession came haltingly, ugly and undeniable. Whitmore admitted what he had done, his words heavy with inevitability. He cleared Caleb's name in the same breath, the charges dissolving under the weight of truth. The law, slow and imperfect, finally bent toward justice. Abigail accepted the written confession with steady hands, feeling something inside her loosen at last. The past had named her once. Now she named it. They returned to the cabin changed. Abigail carried the letter to the river and watched as they buried it beneath the soil, then let the quilt go, its embroidered initials sinking into the current, carried away without ceremony. When she turned back, Caleb was waiting, his face open, unguarded. The world had intruded and nearly torn them apart, but they had stood their ground. Whatever came next, it would not be faced alone. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, in pieces, settling into their lives the way light settles into a room at dusk, slow enough that you hardly notice until it is already there. After they returned from town, after the confession was written and buried, after the quilt disappeared beneath the river's surface, the cabin felt different. The walls were the same, the land unchanged, but the air no longer carried the weight of things unsaid. What had once been a place of hiding became gradually a place of choosing. Caleb woke each morning without the sharp jolt of fear that had followed him for years. His past no longer pressed against his back like a loaded gun. The law had named him innocent, but more than that, he had stopped running from himself. He worked the land with a steadiness born not of desperation, but intention, repairing what the storm had broken and building what had never existed before. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if he understood that endurance mattered more than speed. When he laughed, and it surprised them both the first time, it was quiet, unguarded, the sound of a man discovering that survival did not have to mean solitude. Abigail changed in subtler ways, but no less profound. She no longer flinched at every sound beyond the cabin. The world had named her once as something broken, something shameful, but she had taken that name back and discarded it. She tended her herbs with renewed care, teaching Caleb which leaves soothed pain, which roots healed infection, sharing knowledge she had once hoarded as protection. The land responded to her gentler touch, to the patience she had relearned after years of living braced for loss. When she spoke of the child growing inside her, her voice still carried fear, but it was threaded now with hope she did not immediately crush. They learned the shape of each other's days. Meals became fuller. Silence became comfortable rather than defensive. At night, when the wind moved through the grass instead of screaming through snow, they sat together outside the cabin, watching the sky darken into something vast and forgiving. Caleb spoke sometimes of Ethan, not with the raw edge of guilt, but with the steadier weight of remembrance. Abigail listened, offering no solutions, understanding that some losses did not need to be fixed, only carried honestly. The cabin became a home not because it kept the world out, but because it let life in. Caleb finished the cradle, sanding rough edges until his hands ached, setting it near the bed where the child would be close, protected. Abigail laid fresh quilts across the mattress, new ones, bright with color, stitched not with initials or memory, but with simple patterns meant to endure use. They planted a small garden once the ground softened, their hands working side by side, dirt beneath their nails, sunlight on their backs. Each small act was a declaration, quieter than defiance, but stronger. They were staying. The past did not vanish. It lingered at the edges, in the way Abigail sometimes went still when a man's voice carried too sharply on the wind, in the way Caleb's eye tracked movement even in peace. But it no longer ruled them. They had faced judgment and survived it. They had spoken truth where silence once destroyed. Justice had not come clean or whole, but it had come enough. One afternoon, a summer storm rolled in, sudden and heavy. rain pounding the roof, thunder shaking the ground. Abigail startled at the sound, breath catching, memory rising unbidden. Caleb took her hand without thinking, grounding her in the present. This storm did not trap them. It did not threaten to erase them. It passed, loud and temporary, leaving the air clearer than before. When she leaned into him, it was without fear, without apology. Inside, as evening settled, they wrapped themselves in one of the new quilts, the fabric warm and solid, stitched not with shame, but with patience. Caleb rested his forehead against Abigail's temple, his voice low, steady, certain in a way it had never been before. He told her he was not leaving. Not tomorrow, not when things became difficult, not when fear returned. He had run enough for a lifetime. This was where he stood now. Abigail closed her eyes, letting the words settle, letting herself believe them. She placed his hand over her abdomen, feeling the faint promise of life there, fragile and stubborn. Outside, the land stretched wide and indifferent, still capable of cruelty, still demanding strength. But inside the cabin, something had taken root that the world could not easily tear away. They did not speak of forever. They spoke of tomorrow, of work to be done, of meals to prepare, of weather to watch. Love did not announce itself as salvation. It revealed itself as choice, repeated daily, forged through endurance rather than escape. Two people who had been driven into exile by guilt and shame stood together now, not untouched by the past, but no longer owned by it. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would meet them not as fugitives, not as outcasts, but as something far rarer on that unforgiving frontier. A home. The blizzard that once threatened to erase Caleb Turner and Abigail Moore became the force that stripped their lives down to truth. What began as survival, labor exchanged for warmth, silence traded for safety, slowly revealed deeper wounds shaped by guilt, shame, and betrayal. Caleb's flight from violence and Abigail's exile from a merciless community placed them on opposite paths that converged not through romance, but through endurance. Each was forced to confront a past they had buried, learning that survival without honesty only prolonged suffering. As the storm passed, hope emerged, fragile but real, only to be tested by the return of law and memory. Rather than run again, they chose to stand, facing judgment together. Truth was spoken, justice imperfectly served, and symbols of shame laid to rest. What followed was not a promise of ease, but of commitment, the quiet courage to build a life piece by piece. In the end, love did not save them from hardship. It gave them something stronger, a reason to stay. Against a vast and unforgiving frontier, two broken souls claimed freedom not by escape, but by choosing one another, again and again, until the place that once hid them became the place they finally belonged. End of article. Good night.